Wherever you're joining from, you're very warmly welcome. We're very glad to have you. So this is the Knowledge Festival week, the second one Oxford HR are organizing. It's day 3 and event number 3. And in my opinion, of course, the most important event we will have all week, because we're discussing women in leadership. And as a woman in a leadership position myself, I would argue that there's little more important that we can discuss. So my name is Susanna Escoba. I am the head of the organizational effectiveness practice at Oxford HR. In that practice, we are supporting our client organization at the intersection of leadership development and organizational culture. And thinking about diversity, female leadership, equity and inclusion from a much broader perspective is so absolutely central to what we do in organizational development, and particularly working with the for-purpose sector. And these four amazing, inspiring women you see on our panel are all leaders and spearheading such important initiatives in this field. We're very happy. I feel particularly happy to be with you today, and I would like to extend a very warm welcome to Professor Ona Miller, to Fiona Macaulay, to Dorcas Gwata, and to Zeynep Erdal. And you will all introduce yourselves in just a moment. Before we do that, let me just tell our audience that we do have a Q&A function, which I strongly encourage you to use. Just start, firing away comments and questions right away. And we will weave them into our panel discussion, depending on how the flow will go. We may spend the first 45 to 60 minutes in conversation and then come to your questions. Or if the questions seem to fit in really well, we weave them in. So we'll play it a bit by ear, but please use the Q&A function. So enough from me. I would like to ask our panelists to introduce themselves, and I'm going to ask Ona to please go first.
Well, good morning, everyone. I am Professor Ona Miller, and I am the founder of the Global Female Civility Leadership Institute. And I love education. I'm a global educator and advisor for women in leadership. And I wake up every morning with the purpose and the mission of, breaking barriers, building bridges, and leaving no female behind. So good morning and welcome.
Thank you, Ona. Fiona.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here with you all. I'm Fiona Macaulay, the founder CEO of the WILD Network, which is the Women Innovators and Leaders Development Network. We have a special focus on supporting women at all stages of their career to make their greatest contribution and to grow as leaders, both individually and to support cultures of inclusive leadership within their organizations. One of the perspectives that I'm bringing is of a founder CEO of several social enterprises. And so in that role, I've had the experience of working every day to be a strong leader in settings which are often strapped for resources or where there's a lot of competing demands, and building a lot of partnerships with organizations around the world in different countries. Thanks so much. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you, Fiona. Welcome. Dorcas.
Thank you for having me. My name is Dorcas Guarta. I am a frontline nurse, a public health nurse, and a global health consultant. I work within the intersectionality of mental health, leadership, and innovation. And I'm looking to bring a perspective today, really exploring the context of inequalities and structural inequalities that we have in the world. COVID-19 has exposed everything that we were afraid to face. And my leadership style explores that context, paying attention to high-income countries where I work here in London, but also never forgetting my colleagues in low-income countries and just how much of poor access they have to resources. Thank you.
Thank you, Dorcas. Welcome. And Zeynep.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me here. It's great to be here. I am Zeynep Erdal, and I'm a sustainable development strategist. I'm also the managing director and founder of Worbit Diaries, Women's COVID Diaries. And we're a global online platform that shed light on the nuanced experiences of how the pandemic is impacting women around the world. And I'm here with a perspective to bring in more nuanced perspectives on how the pandemic is impacting women. Thank you.
Thank you, Zeynep. And starting where we are, as you have so well explained already, we are in a pandemic. And I would love to just hand the torch right back to you, Zeynep, and ask you to share a bit more about your experiences around learning what the pandemic has meant for women and leadership.
I think to begin with, it's important to understand that the pandemic has heightened already underlying structures that existed in our society. If there was marginalized groups before, they're even more marginalized in today's world. And I think that's important to recognize. And women being one of these groups, unfortunately, together with children and migrants and refugees. And in terms of the impact of the pandemic, it is quite diverse depending on the region that we're looking at, but the common denominator is that we see a global paradigm shift, and we see that women are being impacted. That in terms of employment, for instance, women are more likely to lose their employment. They're more likely to take care of the burden of childcare, home burden, with getting pushed back into traditional roles in the house chores. For few of them, domestic violence is on the rise, but we also see the trend of female political leadership being put on the spotlight. So we have the marginalization on one end, but we also have the empowerment and resilience on the other end. And I think it's what we're going to discuss today is probably also going to tap on these issues and topics. We do see a lot of negative trends. But then on the other hand, how can we enhance the positive impacts of the pandemic, and how can we make use of and learn from the lessons? I mean, it has been quite, from Warga Diaries, what we do is that we collect stories, individual stories and portraits of women around the world, and to recognize and see the diversity also from country to country, but also from region to region. And in terms of career pivoting, for instance, if we take that as an example, since women are more vulnerable to unemployment, it's also they're more prone and keen to actually career pivot because they're forced to do it. And I think that's important to recognize, which means that they also become more resilient during the pandemic. And in terms of career pivoting, if we take a look at the startup sector, where female-founded startups, for instance, are trying to break loose and they're trying to get through, we see some underlying structures that already existed even before the pandemic, but now is being heightened during the pandemic due to the networks and structures that were there before. So in terms of funding, women only female-founded startups get 2% of all the VC funding in the world. And 2% is nothing. If you have a male co-founder with you, then you might get up your chances to 9%. So there is a couple of barriers, as we were talking about, that is preventing women from taking the stage in leadership positions, not just in employment, but also within the startup scene. I think it's also important to realize the paradigm shift that we have within the tech industry, as well as STEM, since only 30% of the women that are in STEM education and in the STEM field make out of women as well. So that's also alarming, since the future is going to be STEM. And what does that actually indicate, and which results will it have on long-term perspective when the pandemic is over?
Thank you, Zeynep. The uncovering of, oh, I can hear myself very loudly. I hope that's not happening for the audience. No, it's gone. So that uncovering of structural inequalities, which I suppose we always knew were there and now are so visible in plain daylight, Dorcas, is something that you have also alluded to in your introduction, and I know you're working with that. So I would love to also hear from you, your experiences and thoughts.
Thank you, Susanne. And I think I'll take the audience to the front line of my A&E department and cast your eyes on our nurses and doctors who are serving right now as we serve. In London, they will be predominantly from minority background. There'll be nurses and doctors, children of refugees who migrated to this country, who are today serving on the front line. There are hospital cleaners who are from Congo and Peru. There are porters who are from India and also parts of the world. This is a part of what makes London great. But the front line is deeply vulnerable. We pay the highest price on the front line. And for many of those nurses and doctors who've died and many other frontliners, they came to this country to work. They left their families behind in the Philippines, in Malaysia, wherever they did. They are part of the remittance journey. They came here so that they could send money home. Many of those are women, because women make up a huge chunk of the healthcare system. So it is a huge price and a dark hour on our clock when we lose our own frontline staff. And I can tell you that as a nurse who served in that moment, there are deep, dark moments when you yourself know that you are 1 inch away from that statistic. Dorcas Gwata could have been added into the list of BAME staff frontline nurses who died. But something fires you up about that as a woman in a leadership role. Something says, what do I do with what I know and where I am to position myself and advocate for my colleagues? And so I've used every ounce that I can during this pandemic to really advocate for those who have absolutely no agency, no voice, who are deeply vulnerable. In there are women who are exposed in my department and who are exposed to domestic violence. Many of those will be women who are refugees who do not speak any second language or a third language, unable to navigate through the structures of the system. Some of these will be girls who are exposed to sexual violence. And what we forget about pandemics is that we focus on the virus, and rightfully so, because the virus is exactly what is the shock and awe of pandemics. I've been through the HIV crisis. We've ridden through the Ebola crisis. We know pandemics, we're not new to them. But what we forget in the wider social cultural context is that there are wider variable factors that put particularly women at risk. Young girls are much more in the world likely to catch HIV and drop out of school and be married early because of the after effects of the pandemic. So what do we do with all that we know? Here's a call I feel, and pandemic has been really, really strong in amplifying voices like I have. 10 years ago, we were talking about inequalities. We were saying that migrant communities are vulnerable, and nobody was listening to us. And we've been given this window to say, here are the facts. We're pushing policy, we're pushing advocacy, and we're using women, we're asking women to tell their own stories, to amplify those voices that would never be. It's not unheard of for me to, when I'm asked to speak on a platform, I will always say, can I bring someone along with me? It will invariably be a woman. So there's a call for us here, for us women who are in leadership roles, to re-examine our positions and maybe our power. And power is a very huge phenomenon, to think through, how am I utilizing this position to impact on other women who are vulnerable? But I want to say lastly, as I close, I could not have been more proud as a nurse, as an African, to be serving in this pandemic. I couldn't have been. I've not seen on a front line, we see this with soldiers on a front line when we're fighting wars. We see this strong camaraderie, a sense of spirituality that comes together, a sense of collectiveness that comes together. It's that look in the eye and that cup of tea that we have, and it's that support from the community that I would never lose sight of, and I'm deeply proud of.
Thank you, Dorcas. You're also telling a story about trauma and how traumatizing this experience of going through this pandemic has been, on top of all the other things that are going on in the world when we look at how do we lift each other up. And in order to break through trauma, breaking down barriers is really important, and breaking free and making space. And so Ona, I would love to hand over to you and speak about your work around, you called it earlier, breaking barriers, building bridges, and leaving no one behind. Please tell us more.
Well, thank you, Susanne. When I talk about barriers, I want the audience to understand that I am talking about those obvious barriers and then the subtle barriers. The obvious barriers to those external barriers, that we see, the societal barriers, the traditional barriers, the cultural barriers, the economic barriers, positional and systemic and, barriers that we have, and the systematic barriers that, are presented. And then when I talk about, the internal barriers, as women and women in leadership, we talk about intimidation, insecurity, fearful, we feel voiceless, lack of using our voice, lack of transparency, because of, our environment, lack of creativity to where, we are creative beings, but we don't necessarily, talk about our ideas or mention our ideas because of the environment. We talk about relational barriers, and one of the ones that I love more than anything to talk about and to mention to women who are in leadership is our purpose barriers. All of those things that stand in the way from us reaching our purpose in life, as women in leadership. And so how do we break down those barriers? And what are the solutions to, overcoming these barriers, which is what I do every day with my institute, is I teach women how to unlearn and then learn again. Because many of the things that we are facing, we have to look at our belief system, and I'm not talking about religion and all of that. I'm talking about, what do we believe? What do we believe about ourselves? What do we believe about, our intention and our motives and our strategy? What do we believe that we are here to accomplish every day that we wake up with breath in our body? And I think many of us have learned this, category, or we've been put into this box or this category, and we've learned to fit in to what we think people want, or what we think people need, or what we think people desire. And we forget all about our purpose. And so how do we solve these barriers? Well, we show up often, ourselves, just as authentic as we possibly can be. We're real, we use our voice. We do not be fearful, or afraid, and we do not hide anymore. And sometimes we have to just do things, sometimes I say to myself, I really don't want to do this, because I don't want to get the backlash, or I don't want to get the feedback or the responses. But, we can't think about that, because this is really bigger than us. We're talking about women in leadership. So that means that there's a generation watching us. That means that we are an example. We're that demonstration. So we don't have the opportunity to sit back anymore. I think Zeynep mentioned earlier that, we have, the disparities over here, but we also have the empowerment over here. So as women in leadership, we have to bring that balance to where we bring, we leave no one behind. So we're building that bridge from disparity, and we're bringing it, the balance for the empowerment, so that we can all go over this bridge together. We can all succeed together. And I know sometimes, some of the things that we think about is the positional, barriers, where, when you think about female empowerment and women empowerment, they have a tendency to leave out the male or the men. But no, we're saying, come on, everybody's coming. We need that balance. Nobody is going to be left behind. Nobody. And the reason why I say no female left behind is because usually in our societies, in our cultural, and you think about it, multi-dimensional and bilateral, you're thinking about the women usually are behind for whatever reason, so we have to think about that. We bring everybody up to speed, whether it's, salaries in the workplace, whether it's jobs in the workplace for women, whether it's allowing the woman to be creative in who she is purposed to be, to bring balance to an organization, or to bring balance to a relationship or a business partnership. Whatever it is, what we have to do as women is we have to show up as just as authentic as we can possibly be, leaving all of the insecurities behind and just saying, you know what, whatever I was taught before, whatever I learned before, I'm going to be flexible enough to say, you know what, throw that out the window, open the door, just throw it out, and I'm going to learn something different. I'm going to teach something different. And so as a teacher, not only am I learning again, but I'm also reteaching things again. And so that comes mentorship. You know, we have to start mentoring one another. We have to start reaching out and across and reaching up. You know, we can't be afraid to say, hey, I don't know. And what I thought I knew, I didn't know, and it's not working. So that's how we break those barriers. We just come authentically, we come, you know, real, we come transparent, and we just say, hey, this is where we are. You know, we're dealing with the pandemic. This is where we are. Now, how do we get from here? And I think the most important thing, and this is my last point, is that, you know, we identify the barriers, but that's just not enough to identify the barriers. We have to move beyond identification and start, you know, implementing new change, you know, start, you know, tearing down these dysfunctional systems, tearing down these dysfunctional behaviors, calling them out, you know, and just being honest and transparent and real. Have those conversations. No competition, whether that's male to male, whether that's male to female, whether that's female to female. We don't have any competition. We're not competing, you know, generation to generation. No, we're all collaborating. No competition, and we're just, you know, putting it all out there, and let's move forward to do greater and better.
Yeah, I love what you're
Fiona.
saying. I love what you're saying, Ona, and I would like to pick up on something that Ona and both Zeynep said.
Yes.
And that is, and I was going to share a stat that in North America, women and men start businesses at equal rates. So if you look at who's starting businesses, men and women, 50-50. Yeah. But then when you look at which businesses are exceeding the $1 million US dollars in annual revenue, it's 98% men. So what's happening there between the people who start businesses because through an initiative of self-efficacy and, you know, vision for the change that they want to make in the world, and those who are really moving their businesses and, you know, their own position to a place where they have greater power and influence? Well, we see how predominantly male it is. So I just want to share an anecdote that there was an initiative a few years ago that said, we want to get more women over the $1 million in annual revenue. It was called the Make Mine a Million Dollar Business Initiative. And I was in one of those cohorts about 20 years ago, and 80% of our cohort, through setting that target and receiving some fairly actually limited but kind of specific assistance around like leadership coaching and support, you know, in various areas, 80% of our cohort then exceeded that revenue goal, and then, you know, often went to grow businesses that were like even much larger. And in turn, we're having an even greater impact on their communities in terms of the impact that they could have in terms of employment. And then, of course, in terms of role modeling and bringing, as you were saying, Ona, bringing more women, you know, up with them. And what is so interesting to me about having both been in that experience and then observed of others is that it helped us to be invited to sit at that table and to help our own vision be even more, you know, sharpened. And hearing you both speak made me want to share that story, because I think it speaks to it being okay and actually entirely normal to sometimes going for something when we feel like the door has been opened or there's been an invitation that's issued. So for those of us who are engaged in this conversation, that includes everybody who's you know, watching on the screen, I think something to consider is, what can each of us do? Who can each of us invite? And if you feel like, yeah, this is resonating with you, like I wish someone would invite me, I would say go ahead, you know, invite yourself, or reach out to someone who you feel if they could say, yes, you can do it, or yes, I'm going to help you in this way, if that would make a big difference. And it usually makes a big difference. I hope a takeaway for you will be to really go for it and invite yourself, or find someone to invite you to be at the table that you want to be at.
I think that's awesome, Fiona. And I would just like to add to that, you know, I think, yes, I agree with you wholeheartedly that we do need to start inviting one another to the table. But I also want to add, just in case if you don't get an invitation, you know, or say you invite yourself and they, I don't know, reject you, or say, no, not right now. Don't be afraid to go and build your own table and put your own chairs around it, and then go out there and invite those that told you, no, or reject. Go invite them to your table. Go invite others to your table. So I love the idea, Fiona, of inviting, others, or go and, invite yourself. But also don't forget to, just in case, don't wait around for an invitation, or don't wait around. Go ahead, build your own table, invite others, and then invite those that wouldn't invite you.
And I wonder if I can, and these are such rich conversations, aren't they? And I wonder if I can just challenge Fiona and say, look, a table is a Western concept. If we're looking at decolonizing the concept, and I'm taking the table back to Malawi, I'm taking the table back to women who are in Gambia, I'm taking the table back to maybe Saudi Arabia, where the structures are deeply patriarchal. That accessing that table, even if we had to sort of build one around that village, isn't necessarily easy. So I think the realities of the world is that the world doesn't evolve around, the power structures evolve around the West. And there's a conversation that has to be had about what is the role of women in decolonizing the structures that we have. The reality is that with these structures in place, which are white supremacy, male, Western, rich, wealthy, they set the policies and the tone for how the rest of the world lives. That is the reality of our world. It is the world of vaccine equity. It is the world of access to reproductive methods. It is access to knowledge. Who owns knowledge? Who has power to share and who doesn't? So I guess what I'm saying is I'm pushing back and saying, even if we wanted that and we say, take your seat on the table and there are so many barriers and structures that are in place for women. And I want to take us back very quickly to the front line that I'm working in. Racism is something that a nurse like me experience. A junior doctor who's wearing a hijab on my front line is likely to experience racism. Our patients are racist to us. Our patients say to us, I do not want to be treated by a Black African nurse, such as me. I want to be treated by a white doctor. That is our patients talking to us. Somebody will say, I don't want to be treated by somebody who's wearing a hijab. That is our patients talking to us. And I want you to think through, what does that mean to that nurse from Nigeria that patient is talking to? What does that mean to that doctor who's wearing a hijab? It strips us of everything, including our confidence. So I guess what I'm saying to my colleagues today is that the world is deeply, deeply unequal. And COVID-19 has just landed on a bed of inequalities. And I think it is a job of us right here to think through, what does an equal world look like? What does a justified world look like? It should not evolve around policies made in London or Washington or Paris. It has to be equal. It has to work for that woman in Bangladesh. Because I'm not sleeping well unless that woman in Malawi and woman in Zambia has got, I'm not sleeping well. If I'm on the table, I'm not happy unless that voice from those corners of the world that are forgotten are represented on that. So perhaps let's just bring us back to just how deeply patriarchal and unequal the world is.
Thank you, Dorcas. And I would like to link this to organizational life. I mean, we also want to think a little bit about how do we support, how do we lift each other up? How do we support women and everyone else who needs to be supported to reach a useful goal in the end within our organizations where we work, the ones we work with. And so leaving no one behind also, to me, means thinking very carefully about how do we support each other. And sometimes very, well-intentioned initiatives may actually achieve the opposite. And we're trying to help without understanding what kind of help is needed. And I would just love to hear from all of you your thoughts about that. Maybe how can we arrive at a more nuanced, more sophisticated, less fearful approach to working with organizational life. And I think, Zeynep, I just interrupted you. Is that correct? You were going to speak.
It's actually on the same topic, so maybe I can just add to it a little bit.
Yeah.
When we take a look at, I mean, we all need to pave the ways for others. That's definitely something that we all recognize in the room. And as a leader because we do get access, or we make access, or we make sure that we enter different rooms that has traditionally been reserved to a minority in this globe. And the global trends these days, for the past decade, is that now we're creating our own rooms, our own networks. We take the power by creating spheres where we can talk, discuss, where we are trying to put words to the experiences that we're all going through in different various corners of the world. And luckily, digitalization has made sure that we can actually connect and access groups around the world. We can share experiences and see if does this experience actually happen everywhere, or is it just something that is country specific, or that society specific experience. And as Dorcas was mentioning before, we also started realizing that it's not just the table that we sit around. There are a lot of nuances to the experiences that are existing, and that we get an in-depth insight. And the only way to actually raise these issues within organizations or anywhere else is that we talk about them, we acknowledge them, and we challenge them. And by challenging them, we also take action. I mean, the ones that have and that can, they also have a responsibility to make that action. I mean, I have not always been comfortable speaking in public, but I have forced myself, because I do know that the future that I want to leave behind for upcoming generations is not this one. I want to see a change. I want to make sure that women and marginalized groups are getting access to rooms that have been denied to them. And one way of doing is that we should not settle. I'm hearing a lot of people dictating how our future should be, or how a society should be, when they themselves are not actually the ones being marginalized. I don't want to have someone. And this is also why we have to raise our voices and use all the channels that we can. Men have traditionally succeeded more, if you ask me, because they have traditionally occupied networks that have been exclusive male only, where women have not had access. And in terms of investments in startups, etc., that we were mentioning before, Fiona was also mentioning that men do invest in male counterparts because they know them, or because they identify themselves with them. And why do we then, as a network, actually start identifying each other much more than we have done before, and also understand and relate to each other's situation and the experiences that we are going through, so both the common one, but also distinctive ones. And I think that's quite important for us when we move forward.
Thank you so much. Fiona, would you like to?
Yeah, Dorcas, thank you so much for your comments. I feel like in settings like this, often something I'm thinking about is like, who is the audience and what is the action that they're taking on? And so one of the things I think is so impressive about Oxford HR is you brought together a diverse audience. And what I'm hearing in terms of almost like our panelists, it's maybe some of our comments are more or less relevant for different audiences. So allow me to be explicit and intentional in saying this comment, I think maybe is mostly, I offer it for white people who are attending the webinar. And it is that I was so struck by the McKinsey's Women in the Workplace report that they recently put out, that 3/4 of white employees feel like that they are allies to others in the workforce, to women, to people of color, to people with disabilities. But that, in fact, less than half of them are taking basic actions, like speaking up when they see people expressing bias, or championing and creating opportunities for others, when they're not in the room. And I was struck by that because, I really believe that the vast majority of people are well-intentioned and want to do better. So that may not be true, but I'm just going to live in that reality because that's kind of what drives my work. So if we think about how we want to be allies, I guess the invitation that I'm offering, I share that data along with this kind of invitation to think about how can we very concretely be allies in whatever setting we have. So are we in a position to make decisions about where funding is going in the development and the humanitarian sector? And if we are, how are we really ensuring it is going, decisions are being made by people, for example, at the community level, by women who really understand what their communities need. And I am not naive in making this suggestion, because I have also, been at those tables. I have had the privilege to be at those tables. And I know that we are sometimes putting ourselves in the line of fire, or going against the grain, or taking some kind of personal risk when we live the allyship that we really believe. And I guess I just wanted to, I had a conversation with a friend earlier this week, sort of more of a professional acquaintance. And she said, a woman of color in the US who I think is driving really important change. And she said, you know what, Fiona, I am so tired of allies. I don't need any allies. I need accomplices. I need people who are right in there with me, like doing the hard work, doing the lift. And I think what she was saying was, and also taking that kind of personal risk. So I'll leave it there, Susanne. Thank you.
Thanks. And there's actually a question from Rita that really links well to that. And to some extent, you started answering it, Fiona, but let me read it out. How can we identify actions we think might help women worldwide, but are actually counterproductive at every level? So
can we take that to Dorcas? Can we invite Dorcas to respond to that? Because I think it picks up on many of.
And Dorcas, there's actually another question directed at you, which will also fit. So let me read it out to you from Jacqueline. This from a Black woman to another Black woman. It would be interesting to know how you navigate and deal with situations and issues in your positions without having being labeled as aggressive or having the angry Black woman label tagged on you.
Thank you. I'll tackle the last question first, and I'll ask if you can type in the first question in the chat group, so I can reorientate myself. It's a great question. Thank you for asking that, and I love the use of navigate, because actually what we're doing is exploring in a very complex world. Look, my most guiding light in life has not always been academia. I was actually the slowest in the class. I'm dyslexic, but what guides me is emotional intelligence. And those who've supported me, who I run to, and building a team around you that you rely on, mentorship. My great mentor, Dr. Titilola Banjoko, who's phenomenal. We need those circles. And this is important because there are moments when we are challenged, deeply challenged. And the system is expecting exactly that from us. They're expecting Dorcas to rip off a head wrap and scream and shout, and the police arrive, right? And guess who gets picked up? It's the Black woman. And guess who gets labeled, the troublemaker? And I haven't always done this right, and I've had to move, and this is the job of leadership roles and leadership courses that I've done at Oxford University. It's the ability to gather yourself and ask yourself, who am I? Where do I belong? And what is the bigger ask of me? And I think Oprah Winfrey does this so much better than I do. What am I being asked from this moment? And what is my truth? And one example to me was actually a moment in Tanzania when I was on a DFID program. I'd been sent over on UK taxpayers' money, and somebody called me the N-word in Tanzania. It was a colleague, and I didn't know what to do with this. I was further down my career. I didn't have the systems, I didn't have the tools, but I brought it back and I thought, well, rather than make noise in Tanzania, and again, they'll say that, I wanted to come back to the UK and put the onus on the UK managers and the funders. How can we possibly have a UK nurse who's been sent over to another country who's been called an N-word? That is discrimination on taxpayers' money. So these are the tools that I've learned, and I took this back to those who fund. And I say there must be something in the system that allows us to weave through and assess and evaluate people's experiences. This is important. If we don't tackle these things, these are the issues of trauma, anxiety. These are issues of suicide. We know that inequalities cost money. They cost lives. People do kill themselves from this. So it hasn't always been easy, but I have to say my guiding light is that very moment of saying, what do I want for the next generation? And the question I ask myself is, what do I want to be remembered for? What is my legacy? When they lay me down in my grave in Africa and I've done my work, I want to be remembered as a woman who stood up for injustice. And this is important to me. Thank you. And the other question I didn't quite get, how can we identify actions that might help women, but are counterproductive at every level? I hope I'm understanding this question right. But I'd ask the person to maybe specify what they mean. Could they give an example? And then maybe I can come back to this question.
Sure, maybe other panelists have thoughts on this. So it goes back to trying also to zoom into when we look at organizations, we work with organizations, we try and be very concrete around how do we support women in leadership positions. Maybe some things that we do aren't helpful. Maybe, you know, there are things, principles, experiences that we can share here of examples that are working, that you have seen working, and maybe others you have seen not working. That could also be really interesting to share.
Well, I'll just say, Dorcas, that I appreciate the conversation and the topic that you brought forward. I will say that I would have to totally agree with you that it is very hard. And sometimes, you know, you do have to look at the bigger picture. You do have to use that emotional intelligence to say, you know what, just because you call me that, that doesn't mean I have to answer to that, because I know who I am. I know I'm not that. But then at the same time, you have to look at it and because it makes you feel despair. It makes you feel discouraged. It makes you feel anger. And it makes you feel sad all at the same time. But sometimes what I think about is that, you know, we cannot change other people. You know, but we can be responsible for our own, you know, responses, our own reactions, you know, how we respond. And sometimes we have to think, you know, take that emotional intelligence and sometimes take a step back, because it is a very challenging thing when you're facing, you know, white supremacy, or when you're facing those who are scared to speak up for what is right. And I tell my team all the time, no matter what, you do what is right. And if we can stick to just doing what is right, a lot of these things will be conquered. A lot of these things will be, you know, dismantled, disbarred. A lot of these things will be, you know, broken down and taken down. And I think, you know, just as people, you know, no matter what country we're in, no matter, you know, our category, nationality, whether we're, you know, male or female, if we would just start doing what is right as human beings, just doing what is right, you know, thinking about, you know, do I want my daughter to have to go through this? When you start thinking about the next generation, is this what I want my daughter to have to face, you know, when she goes into work? Is this what I want my daughter to have to conquer? Do I want her to be fearful of speaking up? Do I want her to be fearful of, you know, going into a room? So I think if we could just do what is right, that's from all the way to the top officials in the White House, all the way down to those, you know, who may be, you know, homeless. Or if we could just do what is right, that would solve so many of our issues and our problems and our challenges that we are facing. You know, all of the barriers would literally be removed if we would just do what is right. You know, it's not like a hard task. It really isn't. Some of these things that we could apply to many of the challenges that we're facing is very simple. We just have to do what is right. And so I appreciate you very much for your candid topic and conversation. So hopefully this will inspire everybody to just do what is right. Stop and think, you know, and just do what is right.
I wanted to add very quickly, if I may, Susanne, before I hand back to you. I think this is alluding to question about what is counterproductive worldwide and what isn't. Look, we have to have a question here about a conversation about human rights violations in this world. And the clock changes, the campuses change when George Floyd is killed on a pavement of a country called the United States of America, a country that provides aid to Africa and calls countries around the world on human rights. The campus changes when Britain is called and is questioned on its human rights violation on many other areas. The campus simply changes, not least because we've got new graduates who are coming out of universities who are churning out. And I think there is a conversation to be had here about the role of women in really interrogating the status quo that we have around the world. The idea of using aid to manipulate vulnerable, smaller countries and communities has to be challenged. It simply has to be. The idea of structural violence that we see, and this works really well actually in high-income countries because we can put Black men in prisons and we can put them in mental health institutions. We can stop and search them on the street with no dignity whatsoever. And we might even shoot them dead. And that is how somehow justified. And I think we need to be stepping into the space of human rights violation and justice, but demanding something else other than that. These are our kids who are being killed on the streets. The 19-year-old and 15-year-old, and even if it's Black to Black violence, these are our kids. This is happening in our club. And there's something about the female, the women's position in that we are so powerful in navigating that conflict and that contested context. We can step in these roles and say, this agenda here needs a woman to lead, because she's going to come in with a different leadership style. She's going to navigate that style really, really differently. And I wanted to leave this conversation here, and I think that's an important question. A very young girl called Sarah Everett was killed here by a policeman in London. Devastating. He used his police powers to lure her into his vehicle, and he killed her. A writer wrote a note for The Guardian and said, her name is Marina Hines, and she said, we women are all targets. But here's what you can try and do to get away from a policeman. You can interrogate him, you can run into a bus, whatever it is. But she said, if you're a Black woman or a Black person, I wouldn't try this. What she's saying as a writer is, it's going to be very difficult for women like me in London to, if a policeman stops me and says, stop, hands up, if he has bad intentions, it's going to be very difficult for me to challenge those. So I guess what I'm saying is there's something really structured about the way the world is, not just the West. There's something about those structures which is affecting women deeply, and yet the opportunities to bring us out of these crises rest with women. Rest with the young women who are growing up, rest within the community that we're serving. And thus voices must absolutely come out because we're not happy with the status quo. Thank you.
Thank you, Dorcas. We're getting a number of comments that really reflect the complexity of what we're discussing here. And all of them turn around something that's of real interest also to me and is on my mind all the time. So as white women, what is our role? How can we play our role in a way that is empowering other women and others more generally? And we've been getting a few comments on that around, Katerina, for example, shared white supremacy, and I would add patriarchy is not making halt at the gender borders. How many times have we as women looked away? And then Rita is sharing the same question as she writes, many white women ask themselves, how can they help empower others, themselves and other generations without ignoring the differences experienced by other minority in our European societies? And I want to add to that something Ruth shared, an experience, a real anecdote. There was a senior management team made up of women only, 3 white women, and the board's comment was that the team lacked diversity. It needed a man. So it's something that also in our daily work, working with organization, we really grapple with. How How do we approach and define diversity and diversity-oriented work in a way that's credible and that is trying to get at the core of this complexity? I find that really difficult, and I would love to hear your views on that. And I think, Zeynep, you had just started to unmute yourself, so perhaps you could start this round.
Thank you. I mean, when we talk about diversity, the entire discussion these days are a little bit misdirected, if you ask me. We tend to take a look at ethnicity. We tend to take a look at gender. We miss age, we miss class, we miss backgrounds, I mean, there's a lot of nuances to what diversity could be and how it should look like. And in line with some of the amazing comments that have been said before, what we need to do is that we need to start actually taking a look at our own biases and our own languages. Like, where do we actually come from? What kind of background do we have with us? What are the aspects of life or experiences that we ourselves don't understand? I think when you are in a leadership position and you're going to lead others, you also need to understand what others are going through, especially when they're not from the same background, so you can relate to them, so you can understand them, you can understand the challenges that they're going through. A lot of the times, even with the Me Too campaign, I think that was very concrete for me when my male friends started asking me, is this really true? Can it be that a lot of women are still being subjugated to sexual assaults? And in my world, that was just common knowledge. It was a part of my everyday truth. So it's like, how can you have missed one of these dimensions that are so widespread and so well known and acknowledged in the female community, but you as a man have completely missed out on this aspect? So I think where we need to start is also educating ourselves. I don't think we should underestimate that. I think we should also start taking a look and also embrace some of the reports that are coming up, because the knowledge and the data is out there. It's just a question of embracing it and understanding that these figures are not being manipulated. It's actually true. If African Americans are going through discrimination on a structural level in the US, that's not a question anymore, that's fact. And we need to start embracing that as a fact. We need to start asking us, like, how can I myself then take a look and deep dive into this topic, understand the nuances. So rather than just putting it on white female leaders, I would want to put this as to all women, and particularly to women that are leading other women. Because once we start understanding the challenges and the nuanced experiences of the people that we work with and collaborate with, we will also be able to address the issues in a completely different manner. We need to have insights and we need to embrace the reality as it is. And it is complex and it will take time. But I think being open to it is one way to begin. And yeah, I'm trying, I'm still trying. I still realize that there are some biases even on my end that I need to work on every day. So it's a never-ending process, I would say. And the more society is developing, the more we also need to put more effort into understanding it.
Thank you, Zeynep. Fiona, Ona, Dorcas.
Well, there's a question, I feel like this is connected. There's a question in the chat from Istihil Hassan saying, how can women perform strong leadership and how can we support each woman? And I feel like perhaps this is picking up on the themes that all of my esteemed co-panelists have been saying. And also, I hope it kind of speaks to that question, right? If we're looking at what are of the many, many skills that one could be working on to be the strongest possible leader, what rises to the top? And I will offer this idea of leading ourselves first. So often when I think we talk about leadership, it's in relationship with like, how are you doing with leading other people? And I feel like it's important that actually we begin with, how are we doing on leading ourselves? And I'll speak for myself personally. When things are going well, I've had a great night's sleep, my kids get up and eat breakfast on time and get off to school, like I can be an amazing leader. And then when the kids are grumpy, they're running late for school, it's conflicting with my work, the weather is bad, I only got 5 hours sleep last night, it is harder for me to be my best self. And so, and I would say, and I'm sure my team would agree with me, that then affects, how I am leading others. So something I think about a lot is, how can I do the best job of leading myself first to show up to be the leader that I want to be, period, for myself, before it's about leading others. And one thing that's important there is these kinds of self-care things. You know, for me, especially, like sleep is really significant. You know, eating the right things at the right time of day. My goodness, like on a busy day, getting up and going to the loo, right? I mean, these are like basic self-care things that in turn allow me to be a better leader of others. So I guess in answer to that question, I would say kind of lead yourself first and thinking about showing up to be the best person that I want to be. And I'm just curious, if I may, Susanne, I'd love to hear from Zeynep and Ona and Dorcas to hear, like, what tricks are you using? Like, how do you do the best job of leading yourself first, particularly, you know, in the context that we've all been in for, you know, the last year and a half, when, you know, we've been under even more pressure than we might normally be. So Dorcas, let me hand the baton to you next.
Thank you, Fiona. A very important subject. Well-being of the workforce is one of the key issues for me in the healthcare system. Something happens when I'm working in A&E and a nurse comes in and has taken an overdose, or a doctor has taken an overdose, or a doctor who's 6 months away from retirement. Something dark happens in that moment, and we really think, what are we doing to take care of me? And at what point would that's hard, because nurses and doctors have been trained to look after the public and never us. So I pay a lot of attention to this for myself. And if you ask me, one thing I've missed throughout the pandemic, I've missed those moments in Africa when I can pack my suitcase and walk around those markets with my head wrap on and just mingle in the crowds and be Black, right? And I'm not anything other than everybody else is. But I carve a lot of time for yoga for myself. It's my religion. My yoga mat is my prayer mat. That's where I go to focus. That's where I go to do campus. That's where I breathe. That's where I take it in. And that's sometimes my decision-making campus. That moment when I need to just take some deep breaths in and just think through, how do I do this? How do I navigate? Who do I need to talk to? And I think this is important because women aren't by nature allowed. Society doesn't allow us to take those moments. Society says we come into this world, we get pregnant, we give birth, and we look after the next generation. And nobody ever asks in that journey, how are you? It's very rare that somebody asks, how are you? So I think it's important to put that mirror back to ourselves and ask ourselves continuously, how am I today? Where am I? What do I need to do to create more time for myself? Because the cost of not creating time for ourselves is exactly what we're treating in our A&E departments. And the price is paid through, you know, substance misuse, alcohol abuse, drug use, you know, anger, violence, in every sense. These are expressions of non-self-care. So I couldn't spend more time on this because it's really, really important. We're as good as our mindset is, and we're as good as what our ability to give is based on a foundation that we carve for ourselves.
Well, I think I'll go next, Fiona, because I think that's a great question. You know, as women, we are so used to nurturing everyone else, cultivating everyone else, taking care of everybody else, you know, whether that's children, whether that's, you know, our sisters or our mothers or our best friends. I know for me, I am the strong power person in my family. So I'm the secretary to dad, mom, sister, nephew, everybody. You know, I'm the go-to person for everything. And so for me, I think self-care is self-leadership. And so some of the solutions that I've implemented to make sure that self-care and that self-leadership is in place is I've literally had to stop feeling like I was obligated to do everything that everybody asked me to. I stopped feeling like I was obligated to accept every invitation, that I had to be there for everybody, and started showing up for me. And so I started incorporating that little word, you know, the 2 letters, which is no, and not feeling guilty about it. You know, sometimes when we say no, we start feeling so guilty, or, you know, we start feeling like, oh no, I shouldn't have told them no. Okay, Or we'll say, okay, I'm going to do this just one more time. This is the last time I'm going to do it. And then after that, then I'll get to what I need to get to. And those become distractions until we abandon ourselves. Is what we do as women. We start abandoning ourselves, then we lose our identity, then we have to stop and pause and then come back around and figure out, okay, now who am I now that I've gone through all these experiences, that I've, engaged in all these conversations? Who am I now? Because I remember who I was back then, but I feel a little different inside, after this experience. So who am I now? And so for the self-care and the self-leadership, I have to just sometimes just back up, take that moment to meditate. Always take that moment to pray for strategy, pray for, the next intention. Should I be doing it? And should I be doing it now? Sometimes we come up with all of these beautiful creative ideas because we are brilliant beings. Not only are we beautiful, but we're brilliant. And so when we come up with these, do I need to do that now? Because sometimes through my meditation and prayer, I get all these different, creative ideas and things to start implementing and doing and being, but we don't have to do it all at once. And we don't have to do it all at one time. So I think sometimes we need to learn how to pace ourselves. We need to learn how to, take our time maybe and not move so fast, not move so quickly. Just take our time, pace ourselves, get a strategy, get a plan, and don't move before we actually feel within ourselves that it's time. Don't be obligated to present something, or don't be obligated to even be present. I think we just need to wake up and just be, and find out who we are. So that's what I've been doing. That's how I've been doing my self-care, is just really listening to me instead of all the other voices. Just listen to me, listen to the inner me. Where am I? What do I need? What I don't need? And don't be afraid to shed all that stuff off. Maybe it's a business relationship you got into, and now you're in it, you're thinking, wait a minute. This is just way too much. This is not even, with my focus. This is not aligned with my purpose, my assignment. Don't be afraid to admit that, because I think sometimes we get in things and we were just like, okay, I'm in it now, so I've got to see it through. I've got to get it to the end. And by the time you get to the end, you're half dead, emotionally, physically, spiritually, psychologically. You have all these different struggles that you have to, then now you have to deal with those. So that's how I do my self-care, is just really, there's this quote that I say all the time: to thine own self be true. That's the best thing that I can offer. And when you do that, then you can start being true to other people.
Thank you, Ona. Zeynep.
I just want to echo a lot of the things that have been said already, but I think picking up on what Ona said about being, I think that's quite important. We keep on forgetting that there are a lot of expectations at all times. I think also Dorcas was mentioning it before. As a woman, we are expected to be in certain ways. We're expected to be in certain fields or apply to certain positions, etc., etc. And it kind of never ends. I realize that with age, you think that at some point it's going to flip around and there will be a change at some point. It gets worse. And at some point you start realizing that it's not about them, it's about you and what you want, what you need to be, where you need to be, what you need to do. And what is a purposeful life? On my end, it has been about finding meaning in what I do. Do I believe in the things that I do? And my mission is to be the change that I want to see in the world. Where do I want to be in the future? How do I see myself? And putting this up, I had the privilege and also the opportunity to be part of the crisis response team when the pandemic started. And during the first wave, I couldn't even have imagined, living a life that was basically internationally on the road at all times. But the first time in 10 years, I actually had to stop and be in one place and start asking myself, what kind of life do I want to live? I've been on autopilot for so many years, just doing things, running projects from projects, being from country to country, but at the same time, then being in this context together with so many other women and men, just working in the field, trying to prepare a city for different scenarios. was like, but this is where I belong. I want to be in a context where I can actually add some value, and a value that matters. I think it's important to actually just, as you mentioned before, just take a moment and it's like, where do I want to be? And am I happy where I am? Sometimes it's not just about the logics, it's also about the emotions that are being loaded, the energy that we're getting from the things that we do and from the place that we're at. And so more focus on the inner energy is probably what I would suggest.
Wonderful.
I would very, very quickly add to Zeynep's point, which I think is important, that not every woman exists in the individuality, that many women exist in the cultural context of mother-in-law, the whole village. So I can sit here and say, I'm going to be on my yoga mat, but actually the 18-year-old girl who's been married in a village in Mozambique or Bangladesh doesn't have the choice of carving out that time for herself. And I think we should be true to those realities that our settings and our individualism is very Western based. And I accept that as an African woman here living in London. I can tell you, I left some point like a couple of months ago. I just decided to leave every WhatsApp group in my family. And the whole network went on fire because Dorcas is no longer talking to anybody. But I needed to carve out time for myself. I could do that because I am where I am. But it doesn't work the same for my cousins who are, part of the network, where they are. So I think some of this is culturally defined, and I think we shouldn't lose sight of those who can't carve out any time for themselves.
Yes, thank you for making this comment. The academic perspective, not just thinking about the individual experience, but really putting it in context is so important. And I want to link that back to how we think about leadership in organizations. And what I've heard you all speak about is this concept of having a reflective practice. And so extending it from the individual level to our groups is something that I often see missing in the organizations that I consult to. So how can we help to create space and time for teams and groups, entire organizations to actually think and feel? Because a lot of what we're talking about here also is linked to feelings that just go unfelt, right? And workplaces tend to still be understood and portrayed as these very rational locations where we don't feel. But that's a real issue, because if we want to have a good working experience, there needs to be wholeness. So creating reflective practice, space for reflective practice, not just at the individual level, but at the organizational level, and accepting that as a core skill of leadership, regardless of whether you're a man, a woman, or however you identify. And sorry, I just want to really acknowledge that we finally have a comment from a man, from Vivek. Hi, Vivek. And he is writing, grateful to listen to this discussion as a man with family, hearing the different phrases of "we need accomplices, not just allies," really sounds the bell to me as a way to participate, accompany, support my partner's journey. So I suppose being a feminist, figuring out how to be a feminist, isn't the easiest thing. So I really appreciate this comment. And I want to also encourage our audience to share more questions, more comments, and you are also free to raise your hand and to actually speak to the panelists. So if you'd like to make a comment in speaking, just use the raise hand function and we will unmute you and you can interact with us using your voice. So there is another question from Rita, which I think it's really essential and could be useful for us to explore a bit. It goes back to some of what we discussed earlier, how to deal with a fellow woman who's using misogynistic tactics at work as a manager in a leadership position. Any advice for us as people, us as fellow workers and women? So it goes back to how do we support each other and not undermine each other? Who has a thought on this?
I might have a little stab and talk about what we call toxic femininity, right? Yes. We've become so toxic that I have to elbow the next woman to get to the next stage. I have to, this is violence. in its every stretch of imagination, when I have to do whatever I have to do to get to the top. And I think the truth isn't so told about the role of other women in aiding and abating inequalities and violence and trauma, frankly. There is an assumption that we should all get together, we should collaborate, but actually some of the most terrible experiences that I've had of discrimination have been through the hands of women. And so how do we navigate that really, really difficult context? I think we come back to some of the discussions about allyship. I think we come back to building a team of people you trust around us. I think this alludes to what organizations can do. And Susanna, I think you were talking to this. If for me to be really honest about my feelings about my depression and anxiety and the feelings I have about my teenage kids and the fact that I have to send money to Zimbabwe every month, I need a safe space to do so. And organizations have a duty and responsibility to provide those spaces for their employers. They have a duty and responsibility to look out for those people who have been discriminated by other fellow women. People often know what we're doing. They often know what's happening in the corridors. It's often talked about in the corridors, but not necessarily formally. And look at who's really vulnerable and who's hungry for power. And I think those dynamics are exactly what organizations need to pay attention to. We haven't talked much about innovation, and there are many sort of gains from the pandemic. And certainly from a mental health point of view, we've been able to say, well, let's bring in some real innovation into these spaces that are largely male, largely patriarchal, largely power. Everybody's hungry for power. When we look at low-income countries, for instance, our colleagues working in low-income countries have a better work-life balance than we do. They finish work at 5, they hang out in the same village, and they go to each other's weddings and bye-bye. We are a stressed out society. For the better or the worse, for all the cars that we have and the money that we have, we're just a more stressed out society. So I think I'll end by saying it's when we're looking at safe spaces, we probably need to look at what is culturally acceptable. If you're providing a safe space, then allow me to come back in that space and use the language that I can identify with to use that space. Perhaps I don't want to call it depression. Perhaps I don't want to call it anxiety and sleep problems. Maybe I just want to say I've got problems. And guess what? Everybody has problems, and we take a very problem-solving approach to everything. We might actually hear about those experiences of that person who has high exposure to toxic femininity. So there's a duty here, and I think Fiona alludes to this really, really, really well. This idea of what are responsibilities of organizations and what should they be doing better? And I think certainly from a mental health perspective, mental health, because these issues impact on our mental day. If they're not resolved, they become the very issues that we see in our clinical practices. So there's a responsibility of organizations as well as individuals. We must look out for each other. We must send that text. We must, and if you think there's something going on, someone is upset, they probably are, and it's okay. Follow that feeling and offer a coffee and offer, a weekend away or whatever it might be, time off. That's something that we should be offering. So I could not stress more on the importance of mental health and the importance of organizations paying attention to that.
Thank you, Dorcas. Zeynep, you unmuted yourself.
Yeah, I would like to add on the safe space topic, actually, because it's also about creating safe structures within the organization. Informal, formal structures where you can actually report these kind of cases. And a lot of the times, as Dorcas was also saying, you can actually see it. There is a pattern. I mean, if a team, I've seen teams where more or less every single person left the entire team within a year and nobody was questioning the leadership. It was just an assumption that they were moving on to the next project or to the next gig. And for me, that was a bit alarming because as an organization, if there is an entire team leaving the same manager and the manager is the only one in place, then maybe you should start following it up. So I think it's also important to have these kind of structures where you follow yearly, annual. I mean, we have annual reviews at my work, at my day job, at the municipality, which is quite useful because then you can follow up and also see the ranking of the not just the management, but also the climate in the office. Like, how do you actually get along with your coworkers? How is the situation? Do you feel inspired by the work that you do? There are a lot of different mechanisms If we talk about mental health at workplace, there are a lot of different things that we can measure. And I think by doing annual reviews is one way of doing it, but also creating the safe spaces and the safe structures where we can inform others about when something's just not working or glitching.
I would add to that the safe space needs to be safe for everyone, right? So we also need to be careful not to create unintended punitive cultures or approaches, because that would then mean turning the dynamic around, which is also something that tends to happen quite often. So just being aware that the safe space is for everyone, and Dorcas, like you said, where I don't have to call it a particular way, I can just explore what is going on. But can I ask Ruth, my colleague who's also here, by the way, she's the one who has been organizing this whole entire festival. So kudos to Ruth. Can we check with Canary and Anil if they still want to speak, because they both had their hands up. If you could, there we go, Canary. So if you like, please come in, share your question or your comment.
Thank you all. My question really is, I'm a lawyer, and I don't know if you know, law is a very conservative space. And I very recently, I'm just going to share very, very quickly and something that happened to me, and how you would suggest I were to, in an organizational kind of way, how I would deal with this. I work in the ESG net zero space, and obviously there's a lot of work now going on in this race to net zero, leaving nobody behind. And I often find in the legal community that, there's a lot of people, allying with other people that tend to be, of a certain age group, male and pale male stale kind of background. I had a conversation, and they kind of link up with each other on LinkedIn, and they tag each other, and they create a kind of elitist kind of group, right? I had a very interesting conversation with somebody who very recently, who said that I'm making a very good point, and that maybe they want to get there very quickly. So the way they can get there very quickly is by, really just, mobilizing the people that kind of already know and pushing that forward, right? And my response was, well, that's not how it should not be, how any of this works, because it goes against the whole purpose of what climate injustice and everything is all about. And the conversation didn't really, I was then told that I should speak to, some very senior people to make them understand because they're empathetic to it, what the issue is. To which my response, I was horrified, because I kind of thought I was in a Disney, a movie, a Hollywood movie, where the kind of the brown person, and I'm a brown woman, is making, the white person kind of, understand, I'm the kind of, I think you know what I mean, where their shortcomings are. And I'm now in a real kind of, I don't know what to do, to be honest, because, the structures are as they are. And it's very difficult to raise your voice, in a very conservative field, which law is. But when I know I'm right, I know I'm right, and I have got something very, very valid to say. So if anybody has any insights, I would really, really be grateful.
Thank you, Canary. Can I ask two of our panelists to respond? And then we have a comment from Anil, and we only have 9 minutes left. So who would like to respond to Canary?
Canary, may I ask? Oh, can I just ask Canary? So just to sum up, is this a situation where you have older men behaving in sort of a clubby way,
yes,
that is advancing their careers, and and in the process is leaving others feeling excluded, and it's very public?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
And there's a lot of attribution of the ESG movement amongst legal professionals at the moment to the anti-slavery movement, which I'm finding quite a little bit once you get into those kind of dynamics, I really don't know what to say. When then you have a very clubby feel around a very white group of legal, very senior legal practitioners and scholars. It's very difficult then for a 40-year-old brown woman to step in this kind of conservative society.
Okay.
I
So
think
Fiona, would you like to? Yeah, go
Well,
ahead.
no, I have some thoughts, but actually, I think Ona and Zeynep, were you wanting to speak? So please go ahead. I was just wanting to make sure that we and others understood the question. And Kinari, thank you so much. I always think it's so very brave and honest and authentic for someone like yourself to really come forward and ask that kind of question and know that there are other people who are nodding, saying, "Oh, I'm so glad she asked that question."
Oh, thank you.
I completely agree. Thank you for clarifying the question, Fiona, by the way. And from my own experience, being in rooms where unfortunately majority has been white, male, older, and I've been a bit of the odd bird. It took me some time to navigate in all of this, but at the same time, when you're realizing that there will always be, because we started opening the seminar or the panel discussion by talking about barriers. And unfortunately, these barriers are real and they exist. And sometimes we will not be able to change them within those specific structures. But what you can do is that by entering rooms, you can bring other people into that room. You can also start using and taking advantage of identifying different networks where you can start raising these issues. Because once people also start becoming more aware that there is such a trend, because sometimes you just assume it as a reality. It's the norm. You don't have to question it because that's always how things have been done. But then when you start questioning it and raising it within different forums of, if it's in the workplace or if you do it outside of that network, that would be one way of creating awareness and also creating a possibility to actually change those structures. And I think talking about it just as you did today, raising it is the first step. And then navigating it it could be quite challenging. And I hope Dorcas maybe have something where, and Ona was also raised.
And only because thank you for sharing that. That's deep. Thank you so much for bringing that here. Because I've been through these structures, I've had to ask myself some really deep questions. And these are very difficult questions to ask yourself. But I think this is where we become selfish and ask ourselves questions. Is this the right organization for me? Am I being appreciated here? Is there anything I could ever do here that is going to be me? I'm going to be appreciated. Can they ever see past my brown skin? Can they see past my hijab and my head wrap? Maybe they can't. They'll see me as, British born, Indian, and there's that colonial structures. We know that, there's a sense of privilege that if it wasn't for us, the British, they wouldn't be speaking English. And so we know those structures are in place. And these are questions I asked myself when I was deep down a hole some years ago. Is this my place? Is there something else in my career that I'm not paying attention to? What about community service? What about just spending an afternoon, volunteering in a shelter, doing something very, very community-based? What meaning would that bring to my space? I'm a nurse, you're a lawyer. What about that sense of service to the community? Is there something else that is sort of serving? And at my worst, I've taken a pay cut to find my higher purpose. I remember I couldn't pay my mortgage for 2 months because I'd taken a very deep pay cut. But what I wanted to do at that moment is that I wanted to work with communities that are affected by FGM and human trafficking. And I had that opportunity and I couldn't let it go. And it was the highlight of my career. So I think there are deeper questions that only you, and I think you're nearly there. I can hear you. I can hear you. You're very nearly there. The question of where do I belong? And who I am, and what do I need to do to get to that space? I think that question is very nearly answered in your head, but thank you for sharing that.
Thank you. So this is the only unpleasant part of being a moderator. I will have to keep my eye on the time. We only have 4 minutes left. I wish we had a lot more time. It feels like we're just, beginning to really go into dialogue and discourse also with the audience. But I will have to close us down. I'm so sorry. And to do that, I would like to ask all four of you to share a thought, a feeling, an insight that may have arisen for you during the last 90 minutes. As you're leaving this panel conversation, what are you leaving with? Ona.
Okay, well, this is what I'm leaving with. I'm leaving with, just listening to all the panelists and even all the comments and questions, is that, breaking barriers are not easy. And we have to stay the course. Not only just for ourselves, but all of those that are connected to us, the next generation. And so I'm leaving with encouragement to keep going, encouragement to keep breaking those barriers and speaking out and standing for something. I'm leaving with, motivation and a sense of tenacity and fearlessness. To make sure that I keep going to break those barriers and not give up, because there are so many different barriers that exist, and we have to stay the course. We have to ask ourselves, where do we need to be? Like Dorcas said, find out where we need to be, and in being, break the barriers.
Thank you, Ona. Fiona.
My feeling is gratitude. So I'm really grateful for this discussion. So Zeynep and Ona and Dorcas, thank you very much. I've learned from each of you today. And between your comments and the comments and questions in the chat, I have a sense of renewed purpose about the importance of the work that we're doing at Wild, and doing in collaboration with other organizations that believe in a more just and equitable humanitarian and development sector. And I think a more, communities and societies and organizations where women, where people of color, where people who have otherness in some kind or another have the ability to make their greatest positive impact possible. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Fiona. Zeynep?
Inspiration. I think that's the word that is popping up to my head at the moment. And I feel so inspired by everyone in this panel and all the discussions that have been going on. And I feel more convinced than ever that what we do is needed, that we need to shed light, we need to do our part to be the change and make the change in the world. And I think being in a room where you see people and women leaders around the world that are doing it is one of the greatest experiences that a woman can have. So thank you to all of you for being here today.
Thank you, Zeynep. And Dorcas?
Thank you. I reminded myself that I'm not alone. I really am not alone. I'm surrounded by powerful women who are knowledgeable, who are fired up for a better word, for a better world. And that even in my darkest moments, I can reach out anytime and say, guys, let's talk. But also, I'm also fired up to do that much more to support those who can't be here, whose voices could never make it to this table and to this space. Those who don't have a mobile phone are far away somewhere, hidden somewhere. And they're just a number, if that. That I think there's something in me that can do a bit more, obviously not at the cost of my own health, but that can do more to bring those voices on the table. And maybe just appreciation of life. I think the pandemic has reminded us how fragile we are. We really are fragile human beings, that life can be whisked away within a second. And just, as Fiona said, giving gratitude to the fact that we could be here today. Thank you, Oxford HR, for organizing this wonderful discussion.
Thank you all so much. I cannot tell you with how much gratitude and inspiration I've been standing here for the last 90 minutes and leaving. I cannot thank you enough. We're deeply grateful for your generosity in sharing with us your thinking, your feeling, your approaches. Thank you so much. And thank you to our audience for being so engaged. Really appreciate that. Do keep in touch. Through LinkedIn is always a good way to keep in touch. And we have 2 more interesting panel discussions coming up, one around education and one around African philanthropy tomorrow and Friday. So do come back and be well, everyone. Thanks and warmest wishes in all corners of the world.